and give them the bad news that their favorite uncle and I were getting a divorce. I tried to explain this as simply as I could to these young children, and when I finished, we sat in dead silence. And then Nick, who was 9 at the time, looked at me through his wet eyelashes and asked me, "Aunt Cheryl, what did I do wrong?" Remembering this always makes me want to sit down for a good cry, because Nick's loss of innocence is something that we all have to suffer. We get through 2 or 10 or 20 years of life believing in a universe that rewards good and punishes evil, until one day life slams on the brakes and we learn the truth. You can do everything right and still get hurt. Goodness is no protection from pain. If life teaches us that core truth, our faith confirms it. Jesus was as good gets, and still he suffered. He suffered all kinds of pain. He suffered physical pain, but also spiritual and emotional pain. But by facing into it instead of running away from it, he showed us a stunning new way to live, but a way that few of us have followed. In spite of everything that Jesus said and did, most of us still cling to our own version of the truth, namely that if we are very, very good, God won't let anything bad happen to us. We'll be spared. We'll be protected. And this is a great perversion of the gospel, but it's also very human as Peter's response was when Jesus broke the bad news to his disciples for the first time. He was going to die, he told them, and it was going to be awful, bloody and painful and humiliating. But he didn't want them to be fooled. When the time came, they were not to believe that Jesus' death was some horrible mistake that should have been avoided. They were to believe that God was in it, working to turn his dead body into a body that would last forever. And that was what he wanted them to know. But Peter heard only the first part, the suffering and death part, before he exploded, "Lord, forbid it! This must never happen to you." Now, it's hard to tell what was going on in Peter's head. Lots of people say he was putting his agenda ahead of God's, but I think he just loved Jesus so much he did not want him to die. And I also think that death was the worst fear that Peter had, and that Jesus' reference to his own death cranked up Peter's fear so high he couldn't stand it. "God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you." Why? Because if it can happen to you, it can happen to me. It can happen to anyone, and no one is safe. If Jesus was vulnerable, then so was everybody else. And that was what Peter was protesting so strongly. But Jesus' response to Peter was just as strong. "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block for me because you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." It's the hardest rebuke that Jesus gives anyone in all of the Gospels, but his use of the word Satan lets us know just how tempted Jesus was by Peter's words. Peter's suggestion that he should be spared matches something inside Jesus' heart. He would pray the same thing before he died. "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." But meanwhile, God had given Jesus a vision of his death that was not all dark. It leaked light. Something clearly lay beyond Jesus' death, and Jesus knew that his job was to walk toward that instead of run away from it. And it was a vision he tried to share with his disciples by daring them to follow him. If they were not afraid to lose their lives, he told them, they would find them. The image he used was a cross. which had no religious meaning at all at the time because Jesus had not died on one yet. A cross was simply the method of execution favored by the Roman government. It struck fear into people's hearts the same way that an electric chair or lethal injection strikes fear into ours. And there were days when the road to Jerusalem was lined with crosses, each one bearing the dead or dying body of someone whose public execution was meant to scare everybody else who saw it. Crucifixion was not only a very efficient form of punishment, it was also a very effective form of intimidation. It reinforced the idea that death was the most awful thing in the world and that people with any sense at all would do everything in their power to avoid it. But by telling his disciples to pick up their crosses, Jesus defied that idea. He suggested that there were worse things than death, and that living in fear was near the top of the list. If they were going to let fear run their lives, then fear would become their God. The only standard for their behavior would become how much something scared them or not. If it didn't scare them, they'd do it. If it did scare them, they wouldn't do it. And when their anxious days finally came to an end, because death cannot be avoided forever after all, they would discover that they had never really lived at all. But that was not the only choice they had. Instead of surrendering themselves to their fear, they could surrender themselves to God. They could deny the panic-stricken voice inside them, the one that kept ordering them to play it safe, and listen instead for that other voice, the one that says, "Wake up, follow me, don't be afraid." That voice never promised safety, but it has always promised life. That voice has never offered freedom from pain, but it has always offered freedom from fear. I don't believe that we all have to go and get ourselves killed in order to follow Jesus. Some people have, we call them saints, but God seems to allow the rest of us a broader vision and understanding of the cross than that. In Luke, Jesus tells his disciples to take up their cross daily. That sounds more like a way of life than a road to death. Jesus does not tell them to go find their crosses either, because he's pretty sure they already know what their crosses are. Jesus just encourages them to go and pick the wretched thing up, to stop covering them up, stop tripping over them, stop pretending that they're not there. Jesus urges them to squat down and get a hold of those things so that they can find out for themselves that there is more to life than being afraid of death. 2,000 years later, our crosses do not have much to do with standing up to the Roman government, but fear is timeless. And my guess is that each one of us has something of which we are deathly afraid. Maybe it's the fear of death. Maybe it's the fear of admitting an addiction that is eating away at your life. Or maybe it's the fear of tackling a memory that still has the power to suck the breath right out of you. Or maybe it's the fear of standing up for something you believe in. Or maybe it's the fear of telling the truth about who you are to people who are going to damn you for it. Maybe it's the fear of discovering that you have an illness that no medicine can cure, or that your child does, or that a friend does. Whatever it is that scares you to death, so that you start offering to do anything at all, if it will just go away, that is your cross. And if you leave it lying there, it will kill you. If you turn away from it, God forbid it, Lord, with the excuse that this should never have happened to you, then you deny God the chance to show you the greatest mystery of them all. That there, right there in the dark fist of your worst fear, is the door to abundant life. I cannot say more than that. I don't dare, or God might test me on it. But Jesus does dare. Stop running from your cross, he says. Reach down and pick it up. It isn't nearly as scary once you get your hands on it, and no one is asking you to handle it alone. All you have to do is believe in God more than you believe in your fear. Then Jesus says, pick it up. Come on with me, and I'll show you the way to the door, the way to life.